On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 19, Beneath the Surface. Dusty Rhymes sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the stack of papers and files spread across his kitchen table. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. He ran a hand through his tousled hair, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to make sense of the information in front of him. For days, he had been piecing together the fragments of Jackson Browne's empire, following the trail of corruption that seemed to snake its way through every corner of the city. But what he had uncovered went far beyond anything he had imagined. Jackson wasn't just a trafficker, a criminal hiding in the shadows. His reach extended deep into the heart of St. Louis, infiltrating every level of power: politicians, law enforcement, corporate executives. People in positions of authority, people Dusty had trusted, were tangled up in Jackson's web of lies and deceit. The thought made his stomach churn, the betrayal settling like a weight in his chest. Dusty leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he rubbed his temples. His mind was a storm of confusion and anger, the lines between right and wrong blurring before his eyes. How could he fight an enemy that seemed to be everywhere, in every institution he once believed was built to protect people like Mila? The world he had known was crumbling, the foundations he had trusted collapsing beneath him. He glanced down at the photos scattered across the table, faces of people he had thought were untouchable. Politicians shaking hands with Jackson, police officers looking the other way as his operations continued unchecked, CEOs sitting at lavish dinners with the man who controlled the city's darkest corners. Dusty's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists as the anger surged through him. This wasn't just about Jackson anymore. This was about a system built on corruption, a city rotting from the inside out. And the worst part was, he didn't know who to trust. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he paced across the small apartment. His mind raced with questions, doubts swirling in his thoughts like smoke. Who were the good guys? Who were the bad guys? Were there even good guys left? Dusty's heart pounded in his chest as he thought about the people he had relied on throughout his investigation. The officers who had helped him, the city officials who had claimed to be on his side. How many of them were part of this? How many of them were working with Jackson? His breath came in shallow bursts as the weight of it all pressed down on him, the enormity of the corruption suffocating. He had been fighting for so long, had come so far, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. He didn't know where to turn, didn't know who to trust, except for one person. Dusty grabbed his jacket, the sudden need for clarity pushing him out of the door. His feet carried him through the darkened streets, his heart heavy with the burden of the truth he had uncovered. He needed answers, needed guidance, and there was only one person who could help him find the clarity he so desperately sought. The church was quiet, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the walls as Dusty stepped inside. The familiar scent of incense filled the air, a calming contrast to the storm raging in his mind. He hadn't been here in days, too consumed by the investigation, too caught up in the chaos of chasing Jackson. But now, standing in the quiet sanctuary, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. Pastor Ethan Embry was kneeling at the front of the church, his hands clasped in prayer, his head bowed in silent reflection. Dusty watched him for a moment, the older man's presence a steady, grounding force in a world that had become unrecognizable. "Ethan," Dusty called softly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Ethan looked up, his warm, weathered face breaking into a soft smile as he rose to his feet. "Dusty," he greeted, his voice filled with quiet concern. "It's good to see you, my friend. You look troubled." Dusty let out a long breath, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing heavily on his shoulders. He made his way to one of the front pews, sitting down heavily as if the act of carrying the truth had finally caught up to him. "I don't know what's happening anymore," Dusty admitted, his voice low, almost broken. "I thought I knew who I was up against. I thought I understood what I was fighting. But now, it feels like I'm fighting the whole city. Everywhere I turn, there's someone tied to Jackson. Cops, politicians, people in power. They're all in on it." Ethan's expression softened with understanding, his eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that had guided Dusty through so many dark moments. He sat down beside Dusty, his hands resting on his knees as he listened. The corruption runs deeper than I thought, Dusty continued, his voice tight with frustration. Jackson's not just some criminal hiding in the shadows. He's got half the city in his pocket, and I don't know who to trust anymore. How am I supposed to keep fighting when I don't even know who's on my side? Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he considered Dusty's words. The darkness can be overwhelming, he said gently. It can feel like there's no way out, like the whole world is against you. But you're not alone in this fight, Dusty. Dusty's jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides as he fought to contain the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But who am I supposed to trust, Ethan? Everyone I've relied on, everyone I've turned to for help, could be part of this. How do I know who's on the right side? Ethan's gaze softened, his eyes filled with compassion. Trust is a fragile thing, Dusty, he said quietly. It's something we build slowly, brick by brick, and it can be torn down in an instant. But even in the midst of all this corruption, there are good people. People who are fighting for what's right, just like you. Dusty shook his head, his frustration spilling over. How can I be sure? How do I know they're not just lying to me, playing both sides? Jackson's got his claws in everything. Ethan reached out, placing a comforting hand on Dusty's shoulder. You may not be able to trust everyone, but you can trust the truth, he said firmly. The truth always has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. You've already uncovered more than most people ever would. You've seen the extent of Jackson's power, but you've also seen his weaknesses, and that's what you need to focus on. Dusty's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. He had been so focused on the corruption, on the darkness that surrounded him, that he had forgotten about the power of truth. The power of exposing Jackson for what he was, a man who used fear and lies to control a city. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on Dusty's shoulder, his gaze filled with quiet intensity. You have something Jackson doesn't, he said softly. You have faith. You have the truth on your side. And no matter how powerful he is, no matter how deep his influence runs, he can't take that away from you. Dusty's throat tightened as he looked at the older man, the quiet strength in Ethan's voice giving him the clarity he had been searching for. The lines between good and bad were blurred, yes. The corruption ran deep. But there were still people fighting for what was right. People like Megan, people like Pastor Ethan. And there was Dusty. He had seen the worst of the city, had uncovered the filth that festered beneath the surface. But he had also seen hope. He had seen people willing to fight, people who believed in something greater than themselves. And he had seen the power of prayer, the way it had changed him, strengthened him in ways he hadn't yet fully understood. Dusty's hands unclenched, his body relaxing slightly as the anger ebbed away, replaced by a quiet resolve. He wasn't fighting this battle alone. He never had been. Thank you, Dusty said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. I needed to hear that. Ethan smiled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself, Dusty, he said gently. There are people who believe in you, who are praying for you, and you can lean on that strength when your own feels like it's not enough. Dusty nodded, the weight on his chest lifting just a little. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know who he could trust entirely. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop fighting. He wasn't going to let the corruption win. He stood up, the fire in his heart rekindled, his resolve stronger than ever. Jackson Browne's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and Dusty was going to be the one to bring it all crashing down.